On a clear Saturday afternoon in September 1988, a 15-year-old boy walked through a familiar high street in Sutton and then vanished, as if the pavement had opened and swallowed him whole. 2 minutes later, a black digital Swatch watch would freeze at 2:22 p.m. What that stopped watch would reveal would turn an ordinary disappearance into a decades-long hunt through secrets, silence, and institutional darkness. By around 5 o'clock that afternoon, Lee Boxell still had not come home. Peter Boxell stood in the hallway of their house in Cheam, coat still on, keys in his hand, asking the same question out loud to no one in particular. Where is he? He checked the clock again, then picked up the phone and began calling places where Lee usually was friends' houses, numbers he knew by memory, expecting, each time, to hear his son's voice on the other end. That moment of searching is where Lee's story pauses in time, not because anything violent had happened yet, but because something ordinary had failed to occur. Lee Darren Boxell was 15 years old, living with his parents, Peter and Christine, in a semi-detached house in Cheam, a suburban area that prized routine and predictability. On weekday mornings, Lee left for school at roughly the same time, carrying his bag slung low on one shoulder. On weekends, he slept later, drifting between the living room and the kitchen, barefoot, moving with the ease of someone who felt entirely at home in his own space. Nothing about his behavior suggested restlessness or a desire to disappear. Physically, Lee stood out slightly among his peers. At around 5 feet 7 inches, slim, with light brown hair that fell forward when he forgot to trim it, he looked older than some boys his age, but carried himself without bravado. He dressed simply: t-shirts, jeans, shoes chosen for comfort rather than style, and wore a black digital Swatch watch he checked often, more out of habit than urgency. Time mattered to him in small ways. When to meet friends, when to be back, when a show started. Inside the Boxell household, expectations were clear, but not oppressive. Peter and Christine trusted their son. That trust had been built over years of predictable behavior. Lee went where he said he would go, came back when he said he would come back, and explained himself if plans changed. There was no pattern of disappearing for hours without explanation. When Lee was late, it was usually by minutes, not hours. On the morning of that Saturday, the house followed its usual rhythm. Peter remembers seeing Lee slouched in an armchair, half asleep, the television murmuring softly in the background. His legs were tucked awkwardly beneath him, one sock missing, his head tilted forward as if sleep had simply claimed him mid-thought. When spoken to, Lee stirred slowly, blinking, not startled, not defensive, just waking up. There was no argument, no tension, no moment that would later demand reinterpretation. Lee's plans for the day were simple. He told his parents he was going into Sutton town center to meet a friend. He did not pack a bag. He did not take extra money. He did not say goodbye in any unusual way. He put on his shoes, glanced at his watch, and left the house at approximately 11 o'clock in the morning, moving down the street in the direction he had walked countless times before. Sutton High Street was familiar territory to Lee. He knew which shops had the best displays, where music drifted out onto the pavement, where groups of teenagers tended to linger. Window shopping was how he described it, a way to spend time without needing a destination. He liked being among people without having to engage them directly, absorbing the movement, the noise, the sense of activity that made the town feel alive. Socially, Lee occupied a steady middle ground. He was not the loudest in the room, but he was rarely alone. Friends described him as easy to talk to, someone who listened as much as he spoke. He did not seek trouble, nor did he actively avoid confrontation if something felt wrong. His sense of right and wrong was uncomplicated, shaped more by instinct than philosophy. If something bothered him, it showed in his posture before it reached his mouth. At home, football was often the topic that bridged conversation. Lee followed the sport closely, discussing teams and matches with enthusiasm that rose and fell naturally, never tipping into obsession. It was a shared language among friends, a predictable feature of his world rather than a consuming force. Football shaped weekends, but it did not override everything else. Cheam itself reinforced Lee's sense of safety. It was the kind of place where adults assumed children were protected by the familiarity of the environment. Neighbors recognized one another. Public spaces blended into private ones without sharp boundaries. In 1988, before surveillance cameras and mobile phones, safety relied on assumption and trust rather than evidence. Lee moved through this environment without suspicion, guided by routine rather than caution. There were adults in Lee's orbit outside his immediate family, people he recognized by sight, figures who occupied roles that came with automatic credibility, grounds that belonged to institutions, buildings that had always been there, spaces that felt neutral simply because they always had. Lee did not question these things. He had no reason to. Back at the Boxell house, afternoon light shifted gradually, the angle of the sun changing the feel of the rooms. Christine moved between tasks, listening for sounds outside the gate. Footsteps, the familiar rhythm of Lee returning. Peter checked the time again, then again, his concern sharpening not because of fear, but because of deviation. This was not how Lee operated. Their initial reasoning remained grounded and logical. Perhaps Lee had stayed longer than expected. Perhaps he had gone somewhere familiar and lost track of time. Perhaps he would walk through the door at any moment with an offhand explanation. The longer he stayed away, the more those possibilities thinned, not collapsing all at once, but fraying slowly at the edges. What made the silence unsettling was not what it suggested, but what it contradicted. Lee Boxell was a boy who came home, and by early evening, that certainty solid for 15 years had begun to quietly, unmistakably erode. Sutton, London Borough of Sutton, Saturday, September 10th, 1988. Lee reached Sutton town center not long after 11:30 that morning. The high street was already busy, the air carrying a mix of traffic exhaust, fried food from takeaway shops, and the faint sweetness of perfume drifting from department store entrances. Buses hissed as they pulled in and out of stops, doors folding open with mechanical sighs before snapping shut again. People moved with purpose, shopping bags brushing against coats, footsteps overlapping in uneven rhythms along the pavement. Lee spotted his friend near one of the shop fronts, standing half-turned toward the street, scanning faces. They greeted each other easily, without urgency, slipping into conversation as they began to walk. There was no rush in their movement. They drifted from one side of the street to the other, slowing near shop windows, pausing briefly when something caught their attention, then moving on again. This was familiar ground, and they treated it that way. For the next couple of hours, Lee remained in plain sight. The two boys walked, talked, and lingered, their time marked not by clocks but by casual decisions whether to turn left or right, whether to stop or keep going. Lee checked his watch once or twice, more reflex than necessity, his thumb brushing the edge of the black digital face before his arm dropped back to his side. Nothing in his posture suggested anxiety or anticipation. Around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, they slowed near a junction where their usual routes diverged. The conversation thinned as they both began to think about where they were headed next. Lee mentioned, almost in passing, that he might go and watch a football match later. He did not commit to it. He did not check the time again or calculate a route. The word might hung between them, casual and non-binding. "All right," his friend said, shifting his weight, already half-turned away. There was no discussion of meeting up later, no fixed plan made. They said goodbye the way teenagers often do without ceremony, assuming there would be another chance to talk soon. Lee watched his friend walk off, then stood for a moment, adjusting the strap of his watch against his wrist. He did not immediately leave the area. Instead, he blended back into the flow of the high street, moving at an unhurried pace, neither heading decisively toward transport nor lingering in one place too long. This stretch of time between 1 o'clock and just after 2 would later become the most scrutinized period of the day, but at the time it passed unnoticed. Witnesses did not describe anything dramatic. No raised voices, no visible conflict. Lee was simply another teenage boy moving through a public space, indistinguishable from dozens of others. He was seen walking alone, hands loose at his sides, gaze level, occasionally glancing into shop windows as he passed. If he felt watched, it did not show. If he noticed anyone paying him particular attention, he did not react. At 2:20 in the afternoon, a witness later reported seeing Lee standing outside a Tesco supermarket on Sutton High Street. He was not rushing. He was not running. He was upright, visible, part of the ordinary street scene. Cars passed behind him, tires humming against the road, while pedestrians flowed around the entrance, entering and exiting with shopping baskets and plastic bags. Lee did not appear distressed. He did not appear lost. This sighting mattered because of its specificity. The time was noted. The location was clear. Lee was still in Sutton, more than an hour after he had parted ways with his friend. Whatever he had decided to do next, he had not yet left the area. 2 minutes later, at approximately 2:22 p.m., Lee's black digital Swatch watch stopped. The precise reason it stopped was never definitively established. Digital watches of that era did not simply fail without cause. The cessation suggested sudden impact, a sharp blow, a violent movement, something forceful enough to interrupt the mechanism mid-count. The time froze there, not drifting, not fading fixed at the same minute that would later dominate investigative timelines. What happened in those moments did not unfold in public view. There were no confirmed witnesses to an assault, no reports of shouting, no disturbance significant enough to draw immediate attention. If something occurred, it happened quickly and close enough to familiarity that it did not register as a threat to passers-by. From an investigative standpoint, this was the moment of divergence, the point where Lee's known movements ended and speculation began. Detectives would later reconstruct possibilities, testing them against geography, time, and behavior. Could Lee have left the high street voluntarily? Could he have been intercepted by someone he recognized? Could he have followed or been led somewhere nearby without raising alarm? At the time, none of those questions existed yet. The street continued to function, as it always did. Buses came and went. Shoppers carried on. Lee Boxell was no longer visible, but nothing about the environment reflected that loss. By 3 o'clock, the football match Lee had mentioned in passing was beginning miles away. Lee was not there. He had not been seen boarding transport toward it. The assumption that he might have gone faded quietly, replaced by a more troubling reality. Lee's last confirmed location anchored him firmly in Sutton, at a time that made reaching the stadium impossible. Back at home, the gap between expectation and reality widened. By the time Peter and Christine's concern hardened into certainty that something was wrong, the afternoon had already slipped toward evening. The ordinary explanations lost track of time, stayed longer than planned, no longer fit the facts they could observe. From the outside, nothing marked the moment Lee disappeared. No tape cordoned off a street, no crowd gathered. The absence was invisible, but somewhere between 2:20 and 2:22 that afternoon, Lee Boxell's ordinary Saturday ended. And by the time anyone realized that, the window to see what had truly happened was already closing. Cheam and Sutton, Saturday evening, September 10th through Monday, September 12th, 1988. The moment Peter Boxell realized waiting would not bring his son home, the evening took on a different weight. It was just after 6 o'clock when he stopped pacing and reached for the phone again, this time with a steadiness that felt rehearsed rather than natural. He dialed the police and spoke slowly, deliberately, choosing his words as if clarity itself might pull Lee back into reach. He explained that his 15-year-old son had left the house that morning to meet a friend in Sutton and had not returned. He emphasized that this was not normal behavior, that Lee did not stay out without explanation, that something felt wrong. The officer on the other end asked routine questions, their tone professional and calm. Name, age, height, clothing. Where had Lee said he was going? Who was he with? At what time was he last seen? Peter answered each one carefully, pausing to correct himself when needed, aware that these details would become the framework of the search. When the call ended, the house felt even quieter than before. Christine sat at the kitchen table, her hands clasped together so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. She listened to Peter repeat the conversation out loud, as if saying it again might change its meaning. Every few minutes, her eyes drifted toward the front window. The street outside looked the same as it always had. That familiarity felt suddenly obscene. That night passed without sleep. Peter walked outside several times, scanning the pavement, the corners of the street, the darkness beyond the streetlights. Each time he returned inside with the same empty hands. Christine remained at the table long after the mug of tea in front of her had gone cold, listening to the clock tick through minutes that no longer felt connected to time as she understood it. By Sunday morning, September 11th, the disappearance had moved from parental fear to official concern. Police officers arrived at the Boxell home mid-morning. They introduced themselves, took notes, and began asking questions that shifted from conversational to forensic. They walked through Lee's bedroom, opening drawers, noting what was missing and, more importantly, what was not. His clothes were still there. His personal items sat undisturbed. Nothing suggested preparation or intent to leave. One officer made a quiet note. No packed bag, no removal of essentials. That observation mattered. In cases where teenagers ran away, there were usually signs: missing clothes, money taken, personal items gone. Here, the evidence pointed in the opposite direction. Whatever had happened to Lee, it had not been planned by him. Detectives next focused on establishing Lee's movements. They located and interviewed the friend Lee had met that day, taking the statement carefully, line by line. Where did they meet? What time? Where did they walk? What did Lee say? What did he do? The friend's account was consistent and specific. They had spent time together in Sutton town center. They parted at approximately 1 o'clock. Lee had mentioned he might go and watch a football match later. That single word "might" was noted, but not emphasized. From the investigators' perspective, football offered structure. It offered a destination beyond Sutton. It offered a scenario in which Lee could have traveled without raising immediate alarm. The Metropolitan Police had seen similar cases where teenagers followed sporting events impulsively. Within hours, the idea that Lee had gone to Selhurst Park began shaping the direction of the inquiry. The logic was not careless. It was methodical. Selhurst Park was hosting a match that afternoon. Thousands of people would have traveled there by train and bus. A boy moving among that crowd could disappear into anonymity. Officers began contacting transport services, asking staff to recall whether they had seen a teenager matching Lee's description. They circulated his details to officers stationed near the stadium. They prepared appeals for the public. Peter and Christine were informed of the theory. It offered a strange mixture of comfort and dread. If Lee had gone to the match, perhaps he was safe. Perhaps he had lost track of time. Perhaps he would be found among the crowds. But if something had gone wrong there, the scale of the environment made the possibilities harder to contain. By Sunday afternoon, Lee's disappearance was public. His photograph appeared in newspapers. His name was spoken on local radio. Viewers saw his face on television screens, accompanied by a request for information. The Boxell family watched as strangers absorbed their private fear and turned it into a shared concern. The calls began almost immediately. Some tips were vague boys who looked similar, sightings without clear times or locations. Others were more confident, offering specific details that sounded promising at first, and then unraveled under scrutiny. Police logged each one carefully. Officers followed up methodically, unwilling to dismiss anything in these early hours. The volume of information grew quickly, but clarity did not. Peter accompanied officers back into Sutton, walking the same route Lee had taken earlier that day. He pointed out where Lee had met his friend, where they had separated. Standing there, surrounded by traffic and shoppers, he struggled to reconcile the ordinariness of the scene with the fact that his son had vanished from it. Nothing looked disturbed. Nothing looked like a crime scene. By Sunday evening, fatigue began to seep into the investigation. Officers had worked through the day without a breakthrough. The football theory had generated activity, but not results. No confirmed sightings placed Lee at Selhurst Park. No one could say they had seen him board a train in that direction. The assumption still held, but it was beginning to feel thin. On Monday morning, September 12th, the inquiry entered its second full day. Detectives gathered to review what they had. Timelines were redrawn on whiteboards. Statements were reread. One detail began to surface with growing significance: a witness report placing Lee in Sutton at approximately 2:20 in the afternoon. That time mattered. Investigators examined the logistics. The football match had begun at 3 o'clock. The travel time from Sutton to Selhurst Park, even under ideal conditions, would have made arrival nearly impossible if Lee was still in Sutton at 2:20. The realization did not arrive as a dramatic revelation. It emerged slowly, through calculation, through maps and schedules, through the uncomfortable feeling that the investigation might be facing the wrong way. This shift produced tension within the team. Some officers argued the witness could be mistaken. Others pointed out that the sighting was specific and credible. If the witness was correct, then the foundational assumption driving the search, the football match, was flawed. For the Boxell family, this uncertainty was devastating. Each theory that emerged carried hope with it, and each collapse took something away. Christine began to measure time not in hours but in calls received and calls not returned. Peter's exhaustion settled into his body, his movements growing more mechanical as adrenaline gave way to strain. Despite the growing doubt, police did not abandon the football theory immediately. The cost of being wrong in either direction was high. They continued to pursue both possibilities, extending the search outward while quietly redirecting attention back toward Sutton. That split focus marked a turning point. The first 48 hours had been consumed by urgency, movement, and assumption. By the end of Monday, something colder had entered the investigation. The awareness that Lee had not simply drifted away, that the answers were not waiting in a distant crowd, but somewhere much closer, in places already passed over. As night fell again on Cheam, the Boxell house remained awake. The phone stayed within reach. The front light stayed on. And for the first time since Lee had left that morning, the possibility that he had been taken rather than lost began to settle into the investigation with a weight no one could ignore. What followed would stretch not over days or weeks, but over decades, years defined by silence, misdirection, and the slow emergence of a truth buried far deeper than anyone had imagined. Late 1988 through 2011, the search did not stop. It thinned. In the weeks after Lee Boxell disappeared, activity remained visible, officers knocking on doors, patrol cars slowing along familiar streets, posters taped into shop windows and bus shelters. But the intensity of those first days was gone. What replaced it was routine, procedure, a case number that began to age the moment it was written down. For Peter and Christine, time warped. Days blurred into one another, marked less by dates than by absences. Lee's room stayed untouched at first, his clothes still folded, his shoes still by the door, as if preserving the space might preserve the possibility of his return. Christine moved through the house quietly, avoiding the creak in the floorboards outside Lee's room, while Peter filled his days with action, phone calls, letters, meetings with police, anything that felt like movement. The Metropolitan Police continued to work the case, but its center of gravity shifted. Without new evidence, the investigation settled into a familiar pattern. Follow-up leads, re-interview witnesses, review timelines. The football theory, though weakened, lingered in the background for years, shaping how outsiders understood Lee's disappearance, even as detectives grew less convinced by it. Public perception calcified around the idea that Lee had gone somewhere else and vanished there. That assumption had consequences. As months passed, Sutton itself began to fade from the center of inquiry. The idea that something violent had occurred close to home felt uncomfortable, almost impolite, in a community that prided itself on stability. Attention drifted outward to transport networks, to distant sightings, to speculative theories that carried Lee far away from Cheam. Each shift pulled focus from the streets where he had last been seen. For the Boxell family, this diffusion was painful. Peter attended meetings where maps were spread across tables, lines drawn far beyond Sutton's boundaries. He listened as possibilities were discussed in careful, abstract language, but his own logic remained stubbornly local. Lee had not been a boy who disappeared into the unknown. He had been rooted at home, in routine, in familiarity. Christine felt the loss differently. For her, the absence became a physical presence, something that sat beside her in quiet moments. She avoided certain shops, certain routes, places that reminded her too sharply of ordinary Saturdays. Conversations with neighbors took on a strained politeness. Everyone wanted to help, but no one knew how to speak to a grief that had no body, no ending. Years passed. Lee's name appeared periodically in the media anniversary pieces, appeals tied to Crime Watch broadcasts, but each appearance followed the same pattern. His photograph, frozen in adolescence, accompanied by a plea for information. Each time, the family braced themselves. Each time, the surge of hope receded again. Behind the scenes, something else was happening, something slower, quieter, and far more difficult to extract. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, conversations about child abuse operated within narrow boundaries. Public narratives focused on stranger danger, on unknown predators lurking outside communities, not within them. Institutions, churches, youth groups, Local organizations were largely insulated by trust. Allegations, when they surfaced, were often minimized or compartmentalized. Cheam was no exception. Over time, fragments of information began to surface whispers rather than statements. Adults who had once been teenagers spoke cautiously about places they had spent time, about environments that felt unsafe in hindsight but had gone unquestioned at the time. These were not formal reports. They were conversations held years later, filtered through memory and fear, often shared only when prompted. Detectives working cold case reviews began to notice patterns. Certain locations appeared repeatedly in unrelated accounts. Certain names surfaced more than once, often accompanied by hesitation or discomfort. None of it was concrete enough to act on immediately, but it was enough to shift attention. For Peter, the passage of time sharpened rather than dulled his determination. He refused to let Lee's disappearance dissolve into abstraction. He wrote letters. He attended conferences for families of missing people. He learned the language of advocacy because it was the only way to keep his son's case alive in systems designed to move on. One concept came to define the family's experience: ambiguous loss. Lee was neither alive nor dead in any official sense. There was no grave to visit, no ritual of closure to mark an ending. Every unanswered phone call carried the faint possibility that it might be him. Every knock at the door brought a momentary jolt of hope, followed by its collapse. As the years stretched on, the investigation entered a formal cold case phase. This did not mean it was abandoned, but it did mean it competed with newer cases, fresher evidence, crimes with clearer trajectories. Files were archived, then retrieved, then archived again. Each review brought renewed scrutiny and renewed frustration. The turning point did not come from technology or chance discovery. It came from people. By the late 2000s, societal attitudes toward historical abuse had begun to shift. Survivors felt marginally safer speaking about experiences they had buried for decades. Police forces across the United Kingdom revisited cases tied to institutions, re-examining environments that had once been dismissed as benign. In this climate, new witnesses came forward with accounts connected to St. Dunstan's Church in Cheam. These were not casual allegations. They were detailed descriptions of an unofficial youth gathering that had operated on church grounds, in an outbuilding known colloquially as the Shed. Teenagers described it as a place to congregate away from adult oversight, a space where boundaries blurred and authority figures were left unchecked. The name that emerged most consistently was William Bill Lambert. Lambert had worked as the church's gravedigger, a position that granted him unrestricted access to the grounds. To outsiders, he appeared unremarkable, older, quiet, embedded in the fabric of the community. To some who encountered him as teenagers, he was something else entirely. Manipulative, controlling, skilled at exploiting vulnerability under the guise of mentorship. When detectives overlaid this information with the timeline of Lee's disappearance, the alignment was unsettling. Lambert's known offenses, sexual abuse of minors, occurred during the same period Lee vanished. Witnesses described behaviors that fit grooming patterns now well understood, but poorly recognized at the time. One account included a chilling detail: a claim that Lee had been described as dead just days after he disappeared. These statements did not provide forensic proof. They did something more foundational. They reframed the case. The question was no longer where did Lee go? It became, what did Lee see? Investigators began to explore the possibility that Lee's disappearance was not random, not impulsive, and not the result of misadventure. Instead, they considered a far darker scenario: that Lee had encountered something he was not meant to witness, and that his response, intervention, objection, threat to speak, had sealed his fate. This theory did not emerge fully formed. It developed gradually, tested against Lee's personality, his behavior, his known values. He was not a boy inclined to look away. Friends described him as someone who would speak up if something felt wrong. That trait, once admirable, now carried dangerous implications. As police gathered more testimony, they prepared for the most invasive step yet: a forensic excavation of St. Dunstan's church grounds. The decision marked the end of the case's longest, quietest phase. After more than 2 decades of silence, the investigation was about to disturb ground that had been undisturbed for generations, both literally and figuratively. And for the Boxell family, Hope returned in a new, terrifying form. The possibility that the truth had been close all along, buried beneath a place they had passed without suspicion for years. 2011 to 2019. The shift did not begin with a confession. It began with repetition. Detectives reviewing Lee Boxell's cold case files in late 2011 noticed something that had not been visible when the statements were first taken decades earlier. Certain locations appeared again and again, mentioned by different people, at different times, in different contexts. Not loudly, not clearly, but persistently enough to demand attention. One place, in particular, surfaced with an unsettling regularity: the grounds of St. Dunstan's Church in Cheam. At first, the references seemed incidental, a place teenagers passed through, somewhere they gathered, a backdrop to adolescence rather than a focal point of danger. But when investigators laid the accounts side by side, patterns began to emerge. The same outbuilding, the same adult figure, the same atmosphere of blurred authority and unspoken rules. They called it the Shed. The Shed was not an official youth club. It had no paperwork, no safeguarding protocols, no formal oversight. It was an informal space, an annex on church grounds where bored teenagers congregated in the 1980s, away from parents, away from teachers, away from scrutiny. There, they smoked, drank, talked, passed time. To them, it felt like freedom. To a predator, it was opportunity. The man most closely associated with the Shed was William Bill Lambert. Lambert worked as the church's gravedigger. His role gave him unrestricted access to the grounds at all hours. He knew the layout intimately, the paths, the corners, the areas unseen from the road. To parishioners, he was a familiar presence, part of the background of church life. To certain teenagers, he was something else entirely. By 2011, Lambert had already been convicted of sexually abusing 4 girls between 1985 and 1987. He was 75 years old when sentenced to 11 years in prison. The time frame of his crimes overlapped precisely with the year Lee Boxell disappeared. Detectives revisited witness statements with this knowledge in mind. The tone changed. Details that once seemed strange now aligned with known grooming behaviors. Survivors described Lambert as controlling, manipulative, cultivating influence through fear and mysticism. Some spoke of initiation rituals, of being told he could pass on special powers. The language was disturbing not because it was fantastical, but because it revealed a method: isolate, intimidate, dominate. Then came the statements that pulled Lee directly into the orbit. One witness claimed that just days after Lee vanished, they were told flatly that Lee was dead. Another recalled Lambert speaking about burial in ways that, in hindsight, felt pointed rather than metaphorical. Anonymous tips alleged that Lambert had bragged about burying Lee on church grounds. Given his occupation, the claim was not only horrifying, but chillingly plausible. Police did not treat these accounts as rumor. They tested them. They mapped Lee's last known movements against the geography of Cheam. They examined whether Lee could have reached St. Dunstan's Church on foot within the relevant time frame. They looked at who Lee knew, who he might have trusted, who could have approached him without raising alarm. Each question tightened the focus rather than diffusing it. In 2012, the Metropolitan Police made a decision that would redefine the investigation. They would dig. The excavation of St. Dunstan's churchyard became the largest forensic archaeological operation in the history of the Met. The planning alone took months. The ground was consecrated. Families had loved ones buried there. Any disturbance had to be conducted with precision, legality, and respect. At the same time, the scale of the task was immense. If Lee had been buried there, finding him would be like searching for one specific disturbance among decades of legitimate graves. Specialists brought in ground-penetrating radar, scanning the earth for anomalies, areas where soil density suggested something out of place. Each signal was marked. Each potential site was evaluated. Then, slowly, methodically, excavation began. Officers and forensic archaeologists worked day after day, sifting through tons of soil. Shovels gave way to trowels. Trowels gave way to brushes. Every fragment was examined, every layer documented. The work was physically exhausting and emotionally draining. Progress was measured in inches, not breakthroughs. Peter Boxell visited the site when allowed. He watched men and women dig into the ground with careful hands, their movements deliberate, almost reverent. Each exposed patch of earth carried the weight of possibility. Each day that ended without discovery brought both relief and devastation. Relief that no remains had been disturbed unnecessarily, devastation that Lee was still not found. The dig lasted over a year. By 2013, it concluded without locating Lee's remains. Publicly, this was framed as a setback. Privately, detectives understood something crucial. The absence of remains did not equal the absence of a crime. Graveyards are designed to conceal bodies. If someone knew the ground, knew burial practices, knew how to avoid detection, this was the place to do it. The investigation escalated again in 2014. Armed with witness testimony, circumstantial evidence, and behavioral analysis, police made a series of arrests. William Lambert, then 78 years old, was arrested on suspicion of murder, conspiracy to pervert the course of justice, and indecency with children. 3 additional suspects, 2 men and 1 woman, were also arrested, their ages suggesting a disturbing, multi-generational dynamic. One of them would have been a teenager at the time of Lee's disappearance. The theory taking shape was no longer about a lone offender. It was about a network, adults abusing children, younger individuals groomed into silence or complicity, a shared interest in keeping secrets buried. Interviews were intense. Suspects gave conflicting accounts. Timelines shifted, alibis fractured under scrutiny. But without a body, without forensic evidence directly linking Lee to a murder scene, the Crown Prosecution Service faced an insurmountable barrier. Suspicion, no matter how strong, could not cross the threshold of reasonable doubt. One by one, the suspects were released without charge. For the Boxell family, the collapse was brutal. Years of hope condensed into months, then evaporated. But the investigation did not end there. Instead, detectives refined their understanding of why Lee may have been killed. In 2019, police publicly articulated what had been forming quietly for years: the intervention theory. They believed Lee Boxell had witnessed a sexual assault at the shed, that he had intervened or threatened to report what he saw, that this act of moral courage transformed him from bystander to liability. The killing, they concluded, was likely not premeditated, but reactive, a desperate act to silence a witness who would not comply. This theory aligned with everything they knew about Lee: his personality, his values, his unwillingness to ignore wrongdoing. It explained the involvement of multiple people. It explained the code of silence that held for decades, and it reframed Lee's story entirely. He was not a boy who wandered into danger. He was a boy who stood up to it. The revelation brought no arrests, no courtroom reckoning, but it brought clarity, a narrative that fit the facts, the evidence, and the human behavior involved. It also brought a deeper, more painful truth. Lee Boxell likely died because he did the right thing. By the time William Lambert died in 2021, the opportunity to confront him legally had passed. The truth, once buried, now stood exposed but incomplete, its final pieces locked inside people who had yet to speak. And that silence, long protected by fear and complicity, remains the final barrier between Lee Boxell and justice. For now, by the time the Metropolitan Police publicly articulated the intervention theory, the case had crossed an invisible line. It was no longer spoken of as a disappearance in any practical sense. Internally, investigators treated it as a homicide. Externally, they were careful with language, bound by what could be proven rather than what was believed. For the Boxell family, the distinction hardly mattered. The truth they had lived with for years had simply been given a name. There would be no trial for Lee Boxell. William Lambert, the man detectives believed sat at the center of the crime, died in prison in 2021. His death closed the only direct path to a courtroom reckoning. Any confession he might have made, any detail he might have revealed under oath, went with him. What remained were accomplices, people who had been present, who had helped, who had stayed silent, and a justice system that still required someone to speak first. The Metropolitan Police did not close the file. Instead, they shifted their focus again, narrowing it to the living. Investigators made clear, in carefully worded appeals, that anyone who assisted in the disposal of Lee's body, Anyone who helped maintain the cover-up remained criminally liable. Murder might be beyond reach, but conspiracy was not. Silence, they emphasized, was not immunity. A reward of £20,000 remained active. Each new appeal carried a specific audience in mind. Men and women who had been teenagers in Cheam in 1988. People who had spent time at the shed. People who had seen something and learned, quickly, that survival depended on not asking questions. Detectives appealed not to fear, but to conscience. Time, they argued, had shifted the balance. The people who once held power were gone or weakened. The risk had changed. Whether that appeal would ever be answered remains unknown. For Peter Boxell, justice has never meant punishment alone. What he wants is something simpler and far harder to obtain. His son's remains. A place to go. A moment to mark an ending that has never been allowed to exist. As the years pass, that hope becomes more urgent, edged with the awareness of his own mortality. Grief reshaped his life, but it did not silence him. In 2014, Peter joined the Missing People Choir, a collective formed by families living with unresolved loss. He did not join as a performer. He joined as a father who needed another way to speak to his son. He wrote lyrics that articulated what decades of interviews could not. "Where are you now, my boy?" The song, titled "I Miss You," carried his voice and Lee's name into spaces the investigation never could. In 2017, the choir reached the finals of Britain's Got Talent. Millions watched as Peter stood among others like him, singing not for sympathy, but for remembrance. Lee's story reached people who had never read a case file or followed a police appeal. It became human again, stripped of theory and reduced to its core truth. A family still waiting. Christine Boxell has chosen a quieter path. Her grief is less public, but no less enduring. She lives with the constant presence of unanswered questions, the ache of imagining who Lee might have become. Every birthday that passes without him marks time in a way no calendar can. The community around Cheam has changed, too. The case forced a reckoning with assumptions that once went unchallenged, that danger came from outside, not within, that institutions were inherently protective, that good neighborhoods were immune to dark secrets. St. Dunstan's Church, once a symbol of stability, became a reminder of how easily trust can be weaponized. In 2024, the film Reawakening drew inspiration from the Boxell family's experience, focusing not on the mechanics of the crime, but on the emotional reality of ambiguous loss. Peter supported the project for one reason only. It kept Lee's name alive. It reminded audiences that some stories do not end cleanly, and that unresolved grief deserves as much attention as resolution. As of today, Lee Darren Boxell remains missing. No remains have been recovered. No one has been convicted. The file is still open, but the narrative has changed. Lee is no longer framed as a boy who wandered into danger or vanished through bad luck. He is understood, by those closest to the truth, as someone who likely acted, who saw something wrong and refused to ignore it. That understanding does not soften the loss, but it gives it meaning. It transforms Lee from a passive victim into an active moral presence, even in absence. The watch that stopped at 2:22 p.m. still marks the moment his life was interrupted. Time moved forward for everyone else. For the Boxell family, it fractured. And yet, despite the decades of silence, one thing remains undeniable. Lee Boxell was seen. He mattered. And the truth about what happened to him, fully spoken or not, has never truly gone away. It is still waiting. If you were a teenager in Cheam in the late 1980s, if you spent time at places like St. Dunstan's Church, if you ever saw or heard something that felt wrong but was never spoken aloud, that silence still matters. Even now, share Lee's story. Talk about it. Revisit what we assume about safe communities and trusted institutions. And ask yourself honestly, what do you think really happened to Lee Boxell?